Hi everyone!
Damsels and DIY here.
We are so excited to welcome Karmen to the channel, another dazzling damsel who is quite crafty and cool.
Hey y'all, it's very nice to meet you. Today we're here to teach you about stripping. No, not that kind of stripping. Paint stripping. For the last couple of months, Harmony has been working on getting the front portion of this house restored and refinished.
And to help us with this process, we have this awesome extension cord reel with multiple outlets on it from Tack Life, which makes the process just so much easier.
Harmony's husband's family house was built in the early 20th century and is a Portland craftsman model.
The original house featured beautiful wood paneling, archways, and details with a rich stain and finish. Unfortunately, this work had been hastily painted over before the family moved into the house in the early 1990s with an ivory cream paint.
As they were a new family and the original paint was already starting to chip away anyways, they decided to paint over it with a white latex paint, but they already had some ideas about getting the wood back to its original state at some point. No matter what method is used, the main issue is how much time it takes. These are incredibly time intensive and therefore cost prohibitive. We have been using a new process on the wood called heat stripping, which works because the paint is made out of latex and can be loosened with heat.
We are going to teach you how she's doing this and also show you how the wood gets restored from start to finish.
Before we get into it though, there's a few important things you need to know before starting a project like this.
This method will only work with latex-based paints. More importantly, do not try this on lead-based paints. Ever. Never, ever, ever.
Lead-based paints are the majority of paints used before the late 1970s, so many of the old houses have lots of lead layers.
Lead paint can cause lead fibers to end up in your lungs if you scrape or disturb it off the wall, so you need to quarantine it from the rest of the house, which is a lot more difficult.
If you sample your paint layers and get even a tiny hint of lead on your test, we highly recommend that you read up on lead paint removal and talk to a specialist.
Most specialists will recommend removing and replacing woodwork that has lead paint on it.
We got lucky on this project because the paint that we're refinishing was actually painted after 1980. However, we did test another room that had lead paint in it, so we're just gonna have to repaint over that.
You should be prepared with a couple different safety gear options. Clear eye protection can keep dust and chemicals from getting into your eyes, and you don't want to learn that the hard way.
For the same reasons, you will want a filter mask for the dusty portions of the work and some clothes that you don't mind destroying. Totally and completely.
We also use neoprene work safety gloves for the acetone processing portion. Every other type of glove we use was melted through by acetone and destroyed. That being said, expect to buy a few pair of gloves.
I also use knee pads for this project since there's going to be a lot of work near the floor.
Also make sure all your windows are open and your fans are going during this process. Dust, smoke, and chemicals are no joke and you need to stay safe. But with all this in mind, the process is pretty easy to get started.
You can buy a heat gun for $12 at your local hardware store and a cheap metal spackling scraper to remove the bulk of the paint.
To do this, we would heat up the paint on the wall and then scrape upwards to scrape most of it off. We also used some wood carving tools and butter knives to get the more complicated areas clean.
Now this won't remove all the paint, and it might not be as easy for you as it was for us. We had a layer of stain finishing product underneath all the paint that allowed the paint to slip off pretty easy.
If your wood is lighter colored, you could accidentally scorch your wood. Luckily, we didn't have this problem, but still be careful. Also, be careful around windows because the heated frames could potentially warp. You're gonna probably want to scrape those off later with different tools.
After a couple of weeks of that process, I got most of the paint heat stripped off.
Most of the visible paint will likely be left in the grooves of the details, dents, and corners, especially near the floor.
The next step is to remove and chip off as much paint as possible. Now on the walls that you're working on, you're also gonna want to unscrew any light switches or outlet covers because you're gonna want to scrape under those as well.
The tools that we use for this process are paint scrapers, tool picks, and flat edge wood carving tools.
With the tool picks, we would scrape out the angled edges and corners and the silicone latex that was inside some cracks, which was terrible and very difficult to get out.
We actually disassembled some of the wood paneling so that it would be easier to scrape some of the silicone behind them.
After that, we use paint scrapers to get the leftover edges to crack and scrape off that paint that's left over so that we can get a relatively clean piece of wood.
It isn't uncommon for scratches or wood gouging to happen during this process, but it's pretty easy to blend in during the next step.
On some of the really rough corners, we even used a Dremel to get at some of the really hard to get paint.
Next, we break out the chemicals. We've been using 2 different processes for this project. One for detail work where it's hard to get in there and pick out the paint. It's a stripper called SmartStrip.
This material takes about 12 hours to sink into the paint, but it can really help scrape off some of the thicker patches of paint. Unfortunately, it's a pain to clean, so we use it very sparingly.
The next chemical we use is acetone. Yes, that's that stuff that you put on your fingers when you want the colors to go away, but it's a little bit stronger. Now, the Neoprene gloves that we're using are the only ones that don't melt, but you're still gonna wanna buy a bunch of them because they still make your hands stink after a while, like acetone. I was gonna say acetone, but that's an improvs.
Luckily, acetone is one of the safer stripping methods you can use. But make sure you have good ventilation and you don't keep it anywhere near an open flame.
But is that coming from here? Is it coming from here? You
yes,
guys,
it is.
Hold on, I'm pausing a minute. We use the acetone with some steel and plastic scrub brushes, some steel wool, and some muslin cloth to wipe it down.
With those tools and a good amount of acetone, we are able to get a very good, clean, finished look on the wood.
This process is a couple months in, and we're a few weeks from finishing, so we'll show you the finished product in 2 to 4 weeks.
Have any of you ever worked on a similar project in the past? Let us know in the comments below.
If you have any advice on this project, we would love to hear from you.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye!
Good idea. You're both like dripping. Yeah. The lighter brown. There's no way you're getting that out of your makeup.